التجول راح يصير من الساعة 6 يعني بعد مساء وراها تبدي عمليات تستهدف العناصر الإرهابية.
Ead Alawi, the interim Prime Minister of Iraq, has just unleashed 20,000 Iraqi and US troops on Fallujah.
خلينا نقتحم بس المواقع اللي بيها هذول المجرمين ونلقي القبض عليهم ومن يقتل فلا جهنم وبئس المصير. فشدوا حيلكم. ان شاء الله.
Alawi has promised elections in January, and in the struggle to stabilise the country, he's shown he's prepared to be ruthless.
Using extreme force against the population fits within his philosophy or his understanding of Iraqi history. He's a pragmatist, and in order to rule in Iraq, as the Americans have found out, the Allies have found out, you've got to kill people. It's that simple. He knew it, we know it now.
Ead Alawi will have another Saddam government for Iraq. He is so power hungry, and he was always power hungry. The main reason he went back to Iraq is to get power.
He's an unlikely political leader in a sense. I think he's made himself, at least from the American standpoint, the indispensable man.
Once a spy for the Iraqi regime in Europe, Ead Alawi went on to play a key role in selling the war in Iraq to the West. Although he's operated out of the public eye for most of his career, since his meteoric rise to power, disturbing rumours and allegations about his past have begun to surface. Tonight, Dateline tells the story of how Saddam's man in London became America's man in Baghdad.
I remember him and most of the students who went through Baghdad Medical School between 1961 and 1971. They know Ead Alawi very well. So we have to get her authorization and consent for repair as well.
Dr. Haifa Azawi now runs this obstetrics and gynecology practice in Los Angeles. But in the 60s, she studied at Baghdad University with Alawi. In 1970, like many other Iraqi medical students, they both went to London after graduating. She was close to the family of Alawi's first wife and recalls that he was a prominent member of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party and a political ally of Saddam Hussein.
I knew that he was on a big salary from the Ba'ath Party, and they helped him a lot in England.
How did you know that? How did you know he was on a big salary from the Ba'ath Party?
We used to go sometimes to the Iraqi embassy, and we hear from the employees that, so-and-so is a Ba'ath Party representative, he's getting a big money.
The foot soldiers of Saddam's regime in Baghdad also remember Alawi. Dateline tracked down a former Iraqi intelligence officer who was stationed in London in the mid-80s. Now back in Baghdad, Wissam Khazal remembers Alawi helping to spy on fellow students in Europe for the former Iraqi government.
إنه البعثيين كانوا منتشرين كطلاب وانت طبعا منتشرين في أغلب دول أوروبا. وهم مصادر هذولا.
The Ba'ath. When Ead Alawi went to London, was he also a good source of information for Iraqi intelligence?
ما تقبل غلط.
Yes. Must.
But Iraqi intelligence was doing much more than just gathering information in Europe in the 1970s. Abdul Razak al-Naif, a former Iraqi Prime Minister, was gunned down outside this London hotel in 1978. It was the third attempt on his life, and just one of a string of violent attacks on Iraqi dissidents in Europe. There's no hard evidence to show Alawi planned any of these attacks, But Haifa Azawi says his family spoke of his involvement.
He one time left the house and his father-in-law was visiting them, and he leave the house, then he come back to the door and he tell his father-in-law, don't open the door to the mailman, and if you see any box delivered in the house, don't accept it because it might be a bomb.
David Ignatius, a journalist at the Washington Post, is in regular contact with Alawi and has been closely following his career for the last 15 years. He believes that Alawi must have approved or at least known of the attacks on Iraqi dissidents in the early 70s.
Even if he did not himself, kill people or, plot their assassination, he certainly was witting about some just monstrous acts. I don't see how you can get around that. I mean, if we think that Saddam Hussein was, a man who governed by torture and cruelty, someone who was as senior in the Ba'ath Party as Ayad Alawi was, doesn't have clean hands from that period. He was part of a machine that did monstrous things.
Eventually, this machine turned on Alawi himself. Saddam Hussein began to suspect Alawi was working against him in London, and in 1978, Alawi was brutally attacked as he slept.
He was attacked with a hatchet in bed with his wife, and his leg was nearly severed, his chest was cut open with a hatchet. His wife never recovered from the trauma of that. Certainly by then, he was well gone from the party.
No one knows exactly when or why Alawi turned against Saddam. But when Wissam Khazal was sent to London in the mid-80s, he discovered Alawi was being cultivated by both MI6 and the CIA.
هو علاقته بالMI6 قائمة لا محال يعني.
His link, Alawi's link with the MI6 is a must.
هذا ما يختلفون عليه الاثنين.
They are sure about it. I mean, him and his superior.
أنا متأكد شلون هو قاعد قدامي هسه. أنا متأكد إنه اياد علاوي لديه اتصال بالMI6 والMI6 رتب اياد علاوي ترتيب وقدموا هدية إلى CIA.
During the 80s, while Saddam was still in favour in the West, Alawi kept a low profile. But his moment came after the first Gulf War in 1991. With funding from the US, he set up an opposition group, the Iraqi National Accord. By the mid-90s, it had offices in Jordan and Kurdistan.
He was trying to create this network. That's what his group, the Iraqi National Accord, was. It was a network of military officers, intelligence officers, Ba'ath Party members. Unfortunately, it was never as widespread or as strong as Alawi liked to claim.
This was underscored by a disastrous coup attempt that Alawi launched from Amman in June 1996. Alawi had claimed that once the coup began, it would spark mass defections from the Iraqi military.
That's one of the greatest myths there ever was. There's like 4 people involved in this network out of Amman. I've seen, the planning for this thing, this division and that division. There was no contact between Alawi and these division commanders. That's just the end of story, He had a whole list of all these divisions. He said he had intermediaries, he could get to these people, and they're all ready to move simultaneously on Baghdad. And they had a couple officers in the army. There was no 96 coup.
Bob Bayer now lives high in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. But in the mid-90s, he was sent into the mountains of northern Iraq by the CIA. He worked closely with Eyyad Alawi and his arch-rival Ahmed Chalabi to try to overthrow Saddam Hussein. But according to Bayer, Alawi's plot was doomed from the start.
Saddam hears about these things. He controlled this 96 thing from the beginning. And, Saddam said, round up the usual suspects and make it a warning to the other people, execute them in public or in front of their families usually. But, there was no, just get it out of your mind. There's very few things I'm certain about. but there was no imminent coup against Saddam in '96.
Whatever his strengths and weaknesses, he was not a successful coup plotter. You know, I mean, the Brits and then later the Americans kept hoping that he would be able to deliver, you know, a strike against Saddam that he was not able to deliver. That showed in part how good and tough Saddam's own intelligence services were, but it also showed that Alawi's network was weaker than perhaps he was telling people.
While it failed at getting a coup off the ground, the Iraqi National Accord was more successful at running its own bombing campaign within Iraq. It apparently managed to blow up this theatre in Baghdad in 1995, one of a series of bombings of public buildings across Iraq in the mid-90s in which dozens of civilians were killed. A man known as Amne al-Qadami claimed responsibility for the attacks on behalf of the INA. Patrick Coburn, a journalist at the independent newspaper in London, obtained a recording of Qadami's confession in 1996.
So, as I understand it, Qadami admits that he ran a bombing campaign on behalf of the Iraqi National Accord, the organisation that was run by Ead Alawi. That's right?
That's right, yeah. That's what he says that, and says that several times in this recording he made.
And the INA at the time was funded by the United States?
Yes, and he refers again to the worries within the organisation that US funding would stop unless the organisation could show that it was doing something in Baghdad against Saddam.
What sort of places were bombed and what sort of casualties were involved in these bombings?
There seem to have been about 100 people killed. It's difficult to estimate how many died.
The Iraqi National Congress, led by Ahmed Chalabi, was the bitter rival of Alawi's group, the INA, and a competitor for US funds. Chalabi's headquarters in Iraqi Kurdistan were blown up in October 1995, killing almost 30 people. And Patrick Coburn's source claims Alawi's organisation was responsible for this.
Do you know if Ead Alawi was aware of any of this bombing campaign or if he's ever been held accountable for it at all?
He's certainly never been held accountable. I don't see that he could have been unaware of it, because the INA wasn't doing very much at the time. This was its main activity. In fact, it wanted to show that it had some presence in Iraq. So I can't see how he would be unaware of this.
When the US government was trying to build the case for war in Iraq, its years of support for Ead Alawi and other opposition leaders began to pay off. The Iraqi opposition was more than happy to manufacture intelligence on Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and his links to the September 11 attacks. According to former CIA officer Bob Bayer, much of this information was clearly bogus.
10 Downing Street in the White House, the way it worked was essentially, we want to go to war. And they went to the opposition and said, give us talking points. Chalabi and Alawi, who then proceeded to go out and make things up. It's that simple. This is a deductive process. We've decided to do this. It's good for our strategy on terrorism. We have no information. You go, guys, give us talking points, which we can then recirculate in the press.
In December last year, an extraordinary story appeared in the Sunday Telegraph in London. A one-page memo, supposedly handwritten by the head of Iraqi intelligence, had been discovered. It claimed the September 11 hijackers were trained in Baghdad by Palestinian terrorist Abu Nidal with the blessing of Saddam Hussein. On the same page, it also conveniently discussed how Iraq was planning to buy uranium yellowcake from Niger. The memo was provided by Ead Alawi's Iraqi National Accord. He told the newspaper, "We're uncovering evidence all the time of Saddam's involvement with Al-Qaeda, but this is the most compelling evidence we've found so far." Bob Bayer says Alawi had a long record of providing forged documents and dubious information to the CIA.
The whole thing's just crazy. You could sit Alawi down and say, this is crazy, come on. If this really happened, let's see some evidence. He'd say, of course, I got no evidence. But when there was a willing audience, this all changed.
A credible audience that wanted to hear
I found Alawi extremely credible. If you sat him down and just say, this is bullshit, this is not true, he'd say, of course it's not true. And then they'd laugh about it and move on.
Alawi's rival, Ahmed Chalabi, was well known in the West and was widely expected to be installed as Iraqi Prime Minister. But he fell out with the Americans when they accused him of leaking intelligence to the Iranian government. In June this year, it was Ead Alawi who got the top job. But it didn't take long for more allegations of his ruthlessness to appear. Fairfax journalist Paul McGough reported in July that just prior to the handover of power in Iraq, Ead Alawi personally executed 6 prisoners in the back of a Baghdad police station. McGough spoke to 2 men who claimed to be eyewitnesses to the shootings.
And according to both witnesses, at that point Alawi pulled a pistol from his own belt and proceeded to shoot them. And they both gave me a very similar imitation of the hand going down the line, stopping on each of them and shooting dead 6 of them, wounding the 7th in the line.
David Ignatius was in Baghdad when the story broke and questioned Alawi about it.
I asked him about the most recent story that appeared in the Australian press about him executing prisoners when I was there in July. The story had just broken. And I also asked, and he laughed and dismissed it, but then he would. So I also asked people at the American Embassy who were in a position to check his whereabouts because they have the records of his bodyguards who were traveling with him, and I think are either an American company or whatever. And they said that they had, when this allegation first surfaced, looked carefully and had concluded that he couldn't be at the place that he was supposed to have been when this took place because he was somewhere else, and they had the evidence to show that.
Both US government and public commentators we've spoken to in the Middle East and in Washington say that they can prove, that the US government can prove that Alawi was not there at the time that this was supposed to have taken place. How do you respond to those claims?
It's interesting they say they can do that. They've never done it. They've never gone out of their way to prove that he was or wasn't there, other than to claim it in very loose terms. If they've got logs of movements, of the names of officers who were assigned to him at the time, where they were, let's see them.
The interesting thing about this is that, for some Iraqis, the notion that they have a prime minister who's prepared to, pot people, in a police station, which we find horrifying, that they find encouraging in the sense that, well, we got a tough guy back in control.
Mr. Alawi declined repeated interview requests from Dateline's reporter in Baghdad, and at the time of going to air, there'd been no response to a detailed list of questions sent to his office. Alawi has certainly demonstrated his tough guy credentials in the attack on Fallujah, accepting the likelihood that civilians would be caught in the crossfire. But as he declares war on insurgents in city after city, Alawi is rapidly running out of internal support. The Sunni Cleric Association held this press conference after troops were sent into Samarra.
Yeah, John Martinkus, SBS Australia. Do you blame the government of Alawi for the move into Samarra, or do you blame the American military directly?
نحن في بياننا حملنا الحكومة العراقية مسؤولية ما يحدث في سامراء واستندنا في هذه الخطوة على تصريحاتهم. هم يظهرون على الشاشة كل ساعة ساعتين يقولون نحن من أذنا للأمريكيين في هذه العملية الخطيرة. إذن هم شركاء للأمريكيين ونحن نحمل الحكومة العراقية المسؤولية كاملة ونعتقد أنها في الطريق الخطأ.
The Sunni clerics believe they offered Alawi a chance to work together, but they say that opportunity has now gone.
ضيعها حينما بدأ بضرب النجف. الشعب العراقي شعب عاطفي لا يتقبل أن تشترك القوات العراقية مع قوات الاحتلال في ضرب أبنائه وهذا ما فعله اياد علاوي للأسف الشديد.
As a result of the attack on Fallujah, the Sunni clerics have declared they'll not take part in the elections in January. Despite this, Alawi is still claiming the elections will go ahead.
So let me be absolutely clear. Elections will occur in Iraq on time in January because Iraqis want elections on time.
Bob Bayer's mission in Iraq for the CIA was to help overthrow Saddam and install a democratic government. He says Alawi has always been an old-school strongman with little interest in democracy. But not even he believes elections will go ahead in January.
It's just total bullshit. It's just crap. It's, you know, holding elections in Iraq in January, it's just not going to happen. Credible elections. Alawi knows it, but, you know, what can he do? The administration in Washington says we're going to hold elections in January, and we're going to hold you in power. You know, he's got to go along, but he can't get into these cities. They never will be. Oh, yeah, you can get into them. You got to flatten them. You have to flatten all of them: Samarra, Fallujah, Najaf, Karbala, and disperse the population. But I mean, that's not exactly the way you impose democracy.